Others stepped onto the open decks, where the sea was glass calm and the sky was filled with stars. Nothing appeared dangerous. Nothing appeared urgent. But hundreds of miles from land, an invisible trap was slowly closing in. Throughout the evening, wireless operators aboard Titanic received messages from ships farther ahead on the same route. Many carried the exact same warning. Ice. Large ice fields. Drifting icebergs. Danger directly in the path of westbound ships. The warnings kept coming. Some were delivered to Titanic's officers. Some were acknowledged. Others were delayed, overlooked, or simply lost in the noise. And among them was one message that would later become one of the most debated communications in maritime history. For more than a century, historians have examined that message and asked a chilling question. How could a ship equipped with some of the most advanced communication technology of its time receive repeated warnings about ice and still sail straight into disaster? This is not simply a story about an iceberg. It is a story about information. About how critical data moves through a complex system. About the terrifying consequences when that system collapses under pressure. And about a warning that reached Titanic, but never truly reached the people who needed it most. More than 100 years later, the haunting question remains: if the right people had seen the right message at the exact right time, would history have unfolded differently? This is the story of the warning that never arrived where it mattered. The most advanced ship in the world. To understand what happened that night, we first need to understand what the world believed Titanic was. In 1912, ocean travel was not just transportation. It was power. It was engineering pride. It was human confidence made visible in steel. More than 2,200 people were on board. But to them, the ship did not feel like a machine. It felt like a floating, invincible world. Grand staircases echoed with conversation. Warm lights filled elegant dining rooms. And above the ocean deck, the night looked almost peaceful. Too peaceful. Because what nobody could see was the chaotic system working frantically beneath that calm surface. A system that would quietly seal their fate. At the center of that system was a technology still in its early form: wireless telegraphy. Before this, a ship at sea was completely isolated, deaf and blind to the outside world. Now suddenly, information could travel faster than the ship itself. In theory, this was a massive breakthrough for safety. But in practice, it created a deadly new problem. Because for the first time in maritime history, information did not arrive in a controlled way. It arrived continuously, unfiltered, unprioritized, a constant war for attention. And on Titanic, all of this chaotic flow was forced into a single tiny wireless room, run by only 2 operators, handling every single message for an entire transatlantic voyage. This is where historians now shift their interpretation. Because the true enemy that night was not a lack of communication. It was too much communication happening all at once. And no system yet existed to decide what mattered most. From a modern system's perspective, this is the real turning point of the story. Not the ice, but the information architecture around it. Because Titanic was not operating in silence. It was operating under crushing informational pressure. When everything is labeled important, nothing is prioritized correctly. Today we face the exact same pattern in modern systems. Aviation alert networks, hospital emergency triage, global financial markets. A system can be technologically advanced and still structurally blind. Because somewhere in that constant, blinding stream of messages, a critical warning was moving through the wires. And the question is not whether it existed. The question is, how easily can the truth disappear inside a system that is simply too busy to notice it? The night the warnings kept coming. By now, Titanic had already received multiple reports of ice. Some were brief. Some were detailed. And some would later become infamous. But among all the messages crossing the Atlantic that night, one warning was quietly making its way through the wireless network. A warning from a ship called Mesaba. At the time, nobody knew it would become one of the most scrutinized messages in history. For now, it was simply another electric pulse in the dark, and that was exactly the problem inside Titanic's wireless room. The atmosphere was growing tense. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. The room was alive with deafening noise, the harsh, rapid clicking of Morse keys, the constant hissing static of wireless traffic, the endless, exhausting stream of wealthy passengers sending casual greetings back to shore. To modern eyes, it seems completely obvious. A massive ice warning should have stopped everything. But that's not how human psychology works when a system is under siege. The operators weren't staring at a modern screen flashing red danger. They were sitting in a cramped, windowless metal box, buried under a blizzard of paper and constant interruptions. Every incoming message looked important. Every sender believed their message mattered most. And as the cold night dragged on, the flow only intensified. Somewhere beyond the darkness, ships were reporting ice. Ahead. To the west. To the north. Directly across the exact shipping lane Titanic was tearing through. One warning became several. Several became many. And with every new report, the signal of danger became entirely buried under the noise of routine. The iceberg didn't surprise Titanic. The warnings did. Because information doesn't always fail when it's missing. Sometimes it fails catastrophically when there's simply too much of it. And by late evening, Titanic had crossed that point of no return. The crew didn't know it yet. But the most important message of their lives was already racing toward them. Inside Titanic's wireless room. Inside Titanic, there was a space the first-class passengers never saw. A tiny, windowless room buried deep within the ship, defined by constant mechanical heat, and an uninterrupted, suffocating stream of incoming signals. Throughout the night of April 14, this room never stopped functioning. Telegram after telegram poured in. From passengers, from nearby ships, from stations across the Atlantic. Each message entered the exact same narrow bottleneck. And every single one had to be processed by human hands in real time. Two operators managed this entire overwhelming flow, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Two exhausted men fighting an invisible storm. The wireless system aboard Titanic represented cutting-edge communication. But structurally it possessed a fatal flaw. It had no prioritization layer. No classification between a navigational hazard warning and a passenger's stock update. A message from a wealthy passenger asking about Wall Street prices looked exactly the same as a warning about a massive ice field. Everything entered the exact same processing pipeline. As the night progressed, incoming signals increased in density. Each message was technically valid. Each message required attention. But the machine had no brain to rank urgency. It couldn't tell the difference between routine and life or death. So the terrifying burden shifted entirely to human operators. From a modern system's perspective, this is the critical insight. The wireless operators did not fail out of ignorance. They operated inside a trap where human interpretation replaced automated safety. Every single message forced a split-second choice. Is this urgent? Does it interrupt the line? Should I run this to the bridge right now? And this mental evaluation had to happen continuously, under the ticking clock, without full context. The wireless room was not overwhelmed by noise. It was paralyzed by simultaneous relevance. Every message mattered. Every message was valid. But no protocol existed to shout, "This one matters first." This is the ultimate paradox. When everything is marked as high priority, the concept of priority ceases to exist. Decision-making becomes purely reactive. And among all those overlapping transmissions pouring into the room, one message was about to arrive. Not because it was louder than the rest. Not because it looked any different. But because it entered the system at the exact moment when human capacity was already pushed to the breaking point. The Mesaba warning. At approximately 9:40 p.m., a wireless transmission raced invisibly across the North Atlantic. It came from a steamship called SS Mesaba. The message was direct, specific, and unlike many earlier vague reports, it described a massive concentration of heavy ice and large Borg formations spread directly across Titanic's path. Yet nothing about the transmission itself seemed dramatic. No alarm bells rang in the radio room. No flashing red lights. No urgent voice shouted through a speaker. It was just another piece of paper arriving through an already congested machine. Because according to historical records, the transmission successfully reached Titanic. The warning arrived. The critical information existed on board. And yet, what happened to it next remains one of the voyage's darkest mysteries. By the time Mesaba transmitted its report, the operators were fighting a losing battle against a wall of incoming traffic. Messages from VIP passengers. Messages from shore. Messages from other ships. Signals competing fiercely for attention, minute after agonizing minute. Titanic didn't lack information. It drowned in it. And that's what makes the Mesaba warning so haunting. Not simply what it said, but the exact moment it appeared. Because the warning didn't enter a quiet, attentive room. It entered a room already overflowing with demands, already full of interruptions, already paralyzed by decisions. The exact coordinates of their fate were sitting right there on the desk, potentially buried under a pile of routine paperwork. Every incoming message required judgment. Should I handle this now? Should it wait? Under calm conditions, those questions are incredibly simple. But under the crushing weight of a constant workload, they become a cognitive trap. Historians continue to debate exactly how the Mesaba message moved through Titanic's communication chain. But most agree on one chilling point. The warning arrived during a period of absolute, blinding information saturation. And that single detail matters more than the message itself. Because complex communication systems rarely collapse in a dramatic explosion. More often they fail silently. They become quietly overwhelmed. Not by one massive mistake, but by hundreds of small, rational decisions made under severe pressure. The Mesaba warning was not the only ICE report that night. It was one among many. Yet somehow, more than a century later, it remains the message that historians cannot stop talking about. Because it forces us to face a highly uncomfortable question. If the information existed on board, if the warning successfully arrived, if the deadly danger was already known, then what actually failed? When information stays in the wrong place, what happened aboard Titanic in 1912 is often viewed as a tragic, isolated maritime disaster. But when we take a step back, a deeply familiar pattern begins to emerge. Because the core issue was never really about ships or ice. It was about how information moves or fails to move inside complex systems. On Titanic, messages were being transmitted constantly. Warnings were sent. External signals were physically received. But that crucial information did not travel through the full decision chain. And this is where the story expands far beyond history, straight into our modern world. If we look at the modern systems running our world today, we see variations of the exact same structure. Take modern aviation. Air traffic control depends entirely on layered communication channels. A critical weather update is only effective if it seamlessly reaches the full chain, from the radar to the controller to the system log, and finally into the pilot's decision loop. A delay at any single point completely alters the outcome. In modern hospital systems, information flows through strict emergency triage structures. Symptoms are recorded, but it is the prioritization protocol that determines who gets treated first. If a patient's urgency is misclassified in the system, the hospital still functions perfectly, but the outcome can be fatal. In global business systems, information moves constantly through organizational layers. Research proves that delays or filtering at any middle layer can significantly alter the survival of a company. Not because the data was missing, but because it was delayed, diluted, or quietly deprioritized by a busy manager. Across all of these incredibly diverse systems, the pattern is shockingly consistent. The information exists, but its impact depends entirely on where it stops and where it continues. From a systems engineering perspective, the Titanic is not a historical problem. It is a structural one. Any environment facing a high volume of incoming data, multiple simultaneous priorities, and limited human processing capacity will naturally develop a filtering layer. That filtering layer can be a human being, a strict procedure, or an AI algorithm. But it always exists. The key question is not whether the information flows. It is whether it flows correctly through the final decision points. Looking at this from a broader perspective, most complex, modern failures are not communication failures. They are handoff failures. A message can be successfully delivered to an inbox, but still not be acted upon in the right context. This creates a subtle but absolutely critical distinction. Transmission is not the same as understanding. Understanding is not the same as prioritization. And prioritization is not the same as action. Most massive disasters are not caused by a blind spot. They happen when critical truth does not reach the right place, at the right time, in the right form, to the right decision maker. The lesson we still use today. The Titanic is often remembered as a frozen moment in maritime history. A single event in 1912. A ship. A cold night. A disaster recorded in textbooks. But history rarely works in isolated moments. Because what followed the sinking of Titanic was not just global mourning, it was radical redesign. A complete, systemic restructuring of how the world handles information when human safety is on the line. In the years immediately following 1912, official investigations did not only focus on what physically happened to the ship. They focused intensely on something much more important, how the information was handled. Because across every single report, one glaring pattern kept appearing. Warnings existed. Signals were sent. The information was perfectly available. But it lacked the architecture to reach the captain's bridge in time. This horrific realization led to a monumental global agreement, the creation of the SOLAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea. This was not merely a reaction to a single sinking ship. It was the redesign of an entire global industry. SOLAS introduced strict, structured safety rules, standardized emergency communication protocols, mandatory 24-hour radio watches, and strictly regulated distress signaling. Later, this coordination expanded under the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. Emergency communication at sea was no longer left to the informal judgment of an exhausted operator. Signals were classified. Priorities were legally defined. And critical distress messages were designed to forcefully bypass normal communication flow entirely. Information stopped being treated as equal. It became hierarchical by law. From a modern perspective, the ultimate lesson is not about ships at all. It is about decision architecture. The Titanic revealed a terrifying gap that still threatens complex systems today. Information can exist without being acted upon correctly. Modern safety systems are built specifically to eliminate that gap. Not by throwing more data at the problem, but by strictly controlling how data flows when the pressure is on. In modern aviation, critical collision alerts forcefully override any non-essential cockpit communication. In hospital environments, strict triage software ensures that life-threatening urgency is determined before any treatment begins. When human lives are on the line, information cannot compete on equal terms. It must be structured by design. Because unstructured information does not fail loudly with alarms. It fails quietly through delay. The Titanic was a major turning point in communication design philosophy. It forced a global realization that the real enemy was never the absence of information. It was the absence of structure around it. Because the ultimate question for leaders is no longer, what do we know? It becomes, who knows it and when exactly do they know it? More than a century later, the true legacy of Titanic is not found at the bottom of the ocean. It is actively embedded in every emergency protocol, every safety standard, and every modern communication system designed to prevent a fatal delay. SOLAS, the IMO, modern aviation networks, hospital emergency grids, global safety infrastructure. Titanic did not just change maritime history. It changed how the entire world designs information flow during a crisis. And perhaps the most important enduring lesson is this. In complex systems, failure rarely comes from not knowing, it comes from not acting on what was already known. The hardware of 1912 was flawless. The human protocol was not. In our modern age of endless emails, unread Slack messages, and constant smartphone notifications, are we truly communicating better, or are we simply building a bigger, faster pile of unread warnings? I want to